In rural Tennessee, a young historian was about to uncover her family's darkest secret. What started as a simple property inheritance took a shocking turn when she discovered cryptic carvings carved into smoke-blackened walls. Nora Bennett wasn't your typical academic. For 16 years, she had spent her life studying history from a safe distance, known for her meticulous research and emotional detachment from the past. She specialized in facts that stayed still, documented in archives where the dead couldn't hurt her. When she inherited her grandfather's century-old smokehouse and found fresh scratches in decades-old soot, she had no idea she was walking into a cover-up that had lasted nearly 90 years. Nora discovered evidence that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her family. Carvings that documented disappearances, a grandmother who'd been declared dead but might still be alive, and a trafficking operation hidden behind the respectable face of a Tennessee farmer. What began as reluctant inheritance would become a reckoning that exposed a multi-generational conspiracy. The small Tennessee town would never be the same after 3 generations of women finally broke their silence and brought buried crimes into the light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Do the air tasted like ash and old secrets. I stood in front of the smokehouse for the first time in 16 years, keys digging into my palm, and wondered if a building could hold a grudge. The structure leaned slightly to the left, as if tired of standing upright, its tin roof mottled with rust that looked like dried blood in the late afternoon light. The door hung by a single hinge, creating a gap just wide enough to suggest an invitation I didn't want to accept. My name is Nora Bennett, and I'm a historian. I specialize in the kind of facts that stay still, documented in archives and microfiche, safely distant from my own life. But this wasn't a research project. This was inheritance. The county clerk had slid the deed across her desk that morning with the enthusiasm of someone passing me a live snake.
"Congrats,"
she'd said, making it a question, her eyes flicking to the property address and then back to my face with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. She knew something I didn't. Everyone in this town seemed to know something I didn't. I'd signed the papers with my maiden name, Bennett, even though I'd spent years trying to build a life that had nothing to do with this family or this farm. My grandfather Harold had been dead for 3 months before the lawyer finally tracked me down in Nashville. The will was simple. Everything went to me. The land, the house, and this smokehouse that stood 50 yards from the main property. Alone in a clearing of trampled grass and blackberry canes, I approached slowly, boots crunching on gravel that hadn't been raked in decades. The sweet, old meat scent hit me before I reached the door, a smell like rot dressed up in hickory and salt. My stomach turned. I'd researched enough about historical food preservation to know that a properly maintained smokehouse shouldn't smell like anything after this many years. But this one did. It smelled inhabited. The door scraped open when I pushed it, wood swollen with moisture and time. Inside, the air was thick and cold, colder than it should have been for late autumn. Dust motes danced in the thin light, filtering through gaps in the wallboards. The ceiling was low, crossed with soot-caked rafters that looked like charred bones. Along one wall hung a panel of salt-stained hooks, dozens of them, arranged in rows that suggested order, system, intention. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the interior. The floor was scabbed with tar and something darker, a substance that had seeped into the wood grain and dried there permanently. Against the back wall sat a massive curing rack, its shelves empty but marked with vertical grooves, as if something heavy had rested there for years. I stepped closer to the rack, and that's when I saw them. Faint carvings near the base, almost hidden by layers of grime. I knelt down and brushed away the soot with my sleeve. Letters emerged. Initials, maybe. Numbers. I couldn't make them all out, but I could see they'd been scratched into the wood with something sharp, something desperate. That's when I heard it. A child's hum. low and tuneless, coming from somewhere inside the walls. I froze, every muscle locked. The humming stopped the instant I opened my mouth to speak. Hello? Nothing. Just the creak of settling wood and the whisper of wind through the tin roof. I was alone. Of course I was alone. The building had been empty for 30 years. That's what the deed said. That's what the records confirmed. I forced myself to breathe and continued my inspection, moving methodically, treating this like any other historical site. Under the ash bin, tucked behind a rusted grate, I found a nail-punched tin lid. Someone had hammered initials into the metal. E.B. Evelyn Bennett. My grandmother. She'd disappeared in 1936. They found her scarf caught in the creek a mile from here and ruled it an accidental drowning, even though they never found a body. I was named after her, though no one in the family liked to talk about why. My mother had mentioned her exactly twice before she disappeared too, when I was 15, leaving me with questions that calcified into anger over the years. I slipped the tin lid into my jacket pocket and stood up, suddenly desperate to be outside, to be anywhere but in this cold room that smelled like meat and metal and something darker I couldn't name. As I turned toward the door, my phone buzzed. A local number. Miss Bennett, this is Deputy Clay Mercer. Just wanted to check in, see if you needed any help with permits or inspections on the property. I know the smokehouse hasn't been touched in a long time. Could be some structural issues. His voice was warm, careful, the kind of politeness that small-town people use when they're trying to warn you without saying anything directly. I'd met him briefly at the property transfer office that morning. He had the kind of face that looked like it smiled easily, though his eyes had been watchful, cataloguing me the way I catalogued historical documents. "I'm fine," I said. "Just doing an initial assessment. Well, if you need a second set of hands, you let me know. That building's been standing a long time. Seen a lot. Sometimes places like that, they need more than one person to make sense of them." It was an odd thing to say. I thanked him and hung up, wondering what he meant by seen a lot. What had this building seen? What had my grandfather done here besides cure meat? I stepped outside and pulled the door shut, or as shut as it would go with the broken hinge. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and rust. I looked back at the smokehouse and felt something I couldn't name. Not quite fear, not quite curiosity. Something in between that tasted like ash. I scheduled a full clean-out for the next morning. I would approach this logically, scientifically, the way I'd been trained. I would catalogue every artifact, photograph every mark, and treat the building as what it was, a historical structure that needed proper preservation or proper demolition. Nothing more. But as I walked back to my truck, I heard it again. That child's hum, floating through the gaps in the walls, rising and falling like a lullaby sung by someone who'd forgotten most of the words. I didn't look back. I returned at dawn with a toolkit, a respirator mask, work gloves, and a determination to treat this like any other restoration project. The morning was cold and still, fog clinging to the blackberry canes like something alive. The smokehouse looked smaller in daylight, less menacing, just a tired building that needed either saving or tearing down. I'd made my decision overnight. I would document everything, restore what could be restored, and then sell the property. Clean, clinical, quick, no emotional attachment, no digging into family history beyond what was necessary for proper historical preservation. I was a scholar, not a detective. I pushed open the door and immediately noticed something wrong. Fresh scratches marked the soot near the floor, lines that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. They formed a pattern, almost like arrows, pointing toward the sealed corner where two walls met at an odd angle. I knelt down and traced the marks with my gloved finger. The wood underneath was lighter, newly exposed. Someone or something had been here during the night, scraping away layers of accumulated grime to reveal what lay beneath. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to think rationally. Animals, probably. Rats or possums looking for food. Except rats didn't make marks that looked deliberately directional. And possums didn't carve arrows. I pulled out my camera and began photographing everything, treating the scene the way an archaeologist would approach an excavation site. I documented the position of each marking, sketched their relationships to one another, noted the depth and direction of the scratches. As I worked, a pattern emerged. The carvings weren't random. They were a grid. Dates from the 1930s ran along one section of the wall. Tally marks clustered in groups of 5. And scattered throughout like breadcrumbs were arrows pointing consistently toward that sealed corner. I moved to the corner and examined the wall more closely. The boards here were different, newer than the rest, though still decades old. Someone had replaced this section and tried to make it blend in, but time and weather had exposed the inconsistency. I ran my hands along the seam and felt a slight give, a looseness that suggested the boards weren't nailed as permanently as they appeared. That's when I found it. A hidden hinge disguised as a meat hook bracket. The bracket was functional, sure, but it also served as a pivot point. I pressed against the wall and felt it shift slightly inward. A panel, not a solid wall. A door pretending to be permanent. I hesitated. Every instinct I developed as a historian screamed at me to document first, disturb second. But another instinct, older and less academic, pushed me forward. Whatever was behind this panel, it had been deliberately hidden. And those fresh scratches suggested someone wanted it found. I wedged my fingers into the gap and pulled. The panel resisted, then gave way with a groan of old wood and rusted hardware. Behind it, a space opened up. Not quite a room, more like a cavity carved into the building's structure. And inside that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, was a rusted tobacco tin. My hands shook as I pulled it free. The tin was heavy, dented on one side, and sealed with wax that had gone brittle with age. I carried it to the light streaming through the doorway and carefully pried it open. Inside was a fragment of a letter, folded so many times the creases had worn through in places. The paper was yellowed, but the handwriting was clear, elegant, written in the careful script of someone who'd been educated when education for women wasn't common. I unfolded it slowly. The letter was addressed to no one and signed only with initials, E.B. Evelyn Bennett. My grandmother's handwriting, which I recognized from a single birthday card my mother had kept in her jewelry box. One of the few remnants of Evelyn that survived her disappearance. The fragment read, "The shipments come on Sundays now, when everyone's at church. Harold wears his good suit and his Sunday mask, the one where he pretends to be a man of God. But I've seen what arrives in those trucks. I've seen what leaves. The Smokehouse isn't for curing meat anymore. It hasn't been for years. He thinks I don't know. He thinks I'm blind and obedient. But I'm documenting everything. If something happens to me, if I disappear like the others, someone needs to know what really happened here." The letter ended mid-thought, as if Evelyn had been interrupted or had hidden it in a hurry. I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of the words. Shipments, Sunday mask. Others who disappeared. What had my grandfather been doing in this smokehouse? I looked around the interior with new eyes. The hooks on the wall. The tar-stained floor. The drain in the corner that I'd assumed was for brine, but now seemed ominous, purposeful. The curing rack that was too large, too elaborate for a simple farm operation. This wasn't just a smokehouse. It was something else. Something hidden in plain sight. I stepped outside, suddenly needing air that didn't taste like old smoke and older secrets. That's when I saw him, a man in a dark hat and long coat, standing at the tree line 100 yards away, watching me. He was perfectly still, hands in his pockets, face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Hello?" I called out. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there like a figure painted into the landscape. I took a step toward him. "Can I help you?" At the sound of my voice, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing between the trees with unsettling speed. I ran to the edge of the clearing, but by the time I reached the tree line, he was gone. No footprints in the soft earth, no sound of retreating footsteps, just the wind moving through the branches and the distant cry of a crow. I stood there, breathing hard, the letter fragment clutched in my fist. Someone was watching me. Someone knew I was here, knew I was digging into the past. And that someone didn't want to be seen. I walked back to the smokehouse and pulled out my phone. Deputy Clay Mercer answered on the second ring. "I need to see the county records from the 1930s, I said without preamble. "Everything you have on this property. Tax records, permits, police reports. All of it." There was a pause on the other end. "That's a lot of history to dig through, Ms. Bennett. Might I ask why?" "Because my grandfather was lying about what he did here. And I think my grandmother died because she found out. The courthouse archive smelled like mildew and old paper, the kind of smell that settles into your clothes and stays there for days. Clay Mercer had pulled strings to get me access after hours, and now we sat at a wooden table scarred with decades of use, surrounded by boxes of documents that no one had opened in years. "I have to warn you," Clay said, pulling on a pair of cotton gloves before handling the first folder. "A lot of records from that era are incomplete. Fires, floods, or just plain poor record-keeping. If your grandfather wanted to hide something, the 1930s were a good time to do it." I nodded, pulling on my own gloves. I'd spent enough time in archives to know how fragile history could be, how easily it could be erased or rewritten. But I also knew how to read between the lines, how to find patterns in what was left behind. We started with tax records. Harold Bennett had owned 200 acres, more than most small farmers in the area. His annual income, according to the documents, came from tobacco, corn, and livestock. Standard crops for Tennessee in that era. Nothing unusual, except the numbers didn't quite add up. His declared income was modest, but his property taxes suggested he was paying for land improvements that would have cost significantly more than his farming revenue could support. New buildings, expanded infrastructure. A commercial-grade well that was listed in the 1933 assessor's notes. He was bringing in money from somewhere else, I murmured, making notes in my laptop. "Look at this. 1931, he declares $800 in annual income. But he pays for a $2,000 renovation to the smokehouse. Where did that money come from?" Clay leaned over my shoulder, studying the documents. He smelled like coffee and something woodsy, pine maybe. "Could have been savings. Or a loan." "Then show me the loan documents." "Show me the bank records." We searched. There were no loan documents, no bank records that matched the improvements. The money had appeared from nowhere, or from somewhere Harold Bennett didn't want documented. We moved on to church bulletins and local newspapers, the kind of social records that historians love because they reveal the texture of daily life. The Bennett family was mentioned regularly. Harold served on the church board. He organized charity drives. He was described in one 1932 article as a pillar of the community and a model of Christian generosity. But there was a pattern in the language, a subtle repetition that caught my attention. Multiple articles mentioned Harold's temperance work and his efforts to support struggling families during difficult times. The articles were vague, never specifying exactly what this work entailed, but they appeared with suspicious regularity, especially around harvest season. He was building a reputation, I said, creating a public image of a moral, upstanding citizen, which means he was hiding something that would contradict that image. Clay pulled out another box, this one filled with county business registrations. "Let's see if he registered any companies or cooperatives." We found it 20 minutes later. Bennett Cooperative, registered in 1929, just before Prohibition's end. The stated purpose was agricultural distribution and community support services. The cooperative had made regular donations to something called the Widows' Relief Society. Substantial donations, hundreds of dollars over several years. "Pull the records for the Widows' Relief Society," I said. Clay's face darkened as he searched. "There are no records. No incorporation documents, no tax filings, no membership lists. According to the state, this organization never existed, but the donations existed. The money went somewhere." "Exactly." We stared at each other across the table, the weight of what we were uncovering settling over us like dust. My grandfather had created a shell organization to funnel money through, making illegal income look like charitable donations. It was elegant, simple, and completely effective in an era when record-keeping was lax and most transactions were cash. But what was he moving? Prohibition had ended by the mid-1930s, so it wasn't just bootleg liquor. And why the continued operation into the late 30s? Clay opened another folder, this one containing missing persons reports. I pulled these earlier, just in case they were relevant. You'd mentioned your grandmother disappeared in 1936. He spread the reports across the table. I counted 11 missing persons cases filed between 1931 and 1937 in our county and the 3 surrounding ones. Most were transient workers, people passing through looking for farm labor. A few were women, young and poor, the kind of people whose disappearances might not generate much official concern. The cases clustered around specific months. Late October, early November, mid-December, harvest times. Times when Harold Bennett's charitable work was most frequently mentioned in the newspapers. Look at this, Clay said quietly, pointing to one report. A woman named Sarah Mitchell, age 23, last seen in November 1933 near the Bennett farm. The investigating officer's notes were brief, likely moved on to seek work elsewhere. Family not pursuing. I pulled up the carvings I'd photographed in the Smokehouse on my laptop and compared them to the missing persons reports. The dates matched. Where there was a cluster of tally marks in the carvings, there was a corresponding cluster of disappearances in the reports. My grandmother had been keeping score. She'd been tracking what Harold was doing, carving evidence into the walls of the building where his crimes took place. He wasn't just running bootleg liquor, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He was moving people, trafficking them maybe, or worse. Clay sat back, his face pale. And your grandmother figured it out. We worked in silence for another hour, cross-referencing documents, building a timeline. A freight exemption request from 1934 caught Clay's attention. He stared at it for a long moment before sliding it across the table to me. That signature, he said. Third line down. I looked. William Mercer, deputy sheriff. Clay's great-grandfather. He signed off on a freight exemption for the Bennett farm, Clay continued, his voice tight. No inspection required for incoming shipments. Valid for 2 years. My family was involved in this. I reached across the table and touched his hand. You're not responsible for what they did, but I'm responsible for what I do now. And I'm going to help you figure out exactly what happened here, no matter who it implicates. We were about to pack up when the librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, appeared in the doorway. She'd been watching us work from her desk near the entrance, saying nothing, but now she approached hesitantly. I heard you asking about the Bennett family, she said. I knew Evelyn. Not well, but we were in the church ladies' auxiliary together back when I was young. She was different from the other farm wives. Quiet, but not shy. Watchful. My mother used to say Evelyn Bennett had eyes like she already knew your secrets. Do you remember anything specific about her? I asked. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment, then nodded. The last time I saw her was in October 1936, just a few weeks before they said she drowned. She came to the library and asked for back issues of the newspaper, specific dates. I asked her what she was researching, and she said, sometimes the only way to stop a bad thing is to prove it happened. Then she checked out a book on investigative journalism techniques, and I never saw her again. She paused at the door, looking back at us. Everyone said she drowned, but I never believed it. Evelyn Bennett was too smart to fall in a creek by accident. If she disappeared, it was because someone wanted her gone. After Mrs. Henderson left, I pulled out the letter fragment I'd found in the smokehouse and read it again. Seeing it now in the context of everything we'd uncovered, Evelyn hadn't been a passive victim. She'd been an investigator, building a case against her own husband, carving evidence into walls, hiding documents, preparing for the moment when someone would finally look. There's a note here, Clay said, pointing to a marginal notation on one of the freight ledgers. It says EB Journal, Smokehouse West Wall. Someone tried to erase it but didn't quite manage. The West Wall. I'd been so focused on the carvings and the hidden panel that I hadn't examined the wall itself. But if there was a journal, If Evelyn had documented everything she'd discovered, then we had more than scattered evidence. We had testimony. I stood up, gathering the documents we'd photographed. We need to go back to the smokehouse, tonight. Clay checked his watch. It was past 9. Are you sure? It'll be dark. I've waited 16 years to understand why my mother grew up without knowing her own mother. I'm not waiting another night. We drove back to the farm in Clay's cruiser, headlights cutting through fog that had settled over the back roads like something solid. The smokehouse loomed in the darkness, a silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. I'd left the door open earlier, and now it gaped like a mouth, inviting us back inside. We worked by headlamp and flashlight, chipping carefully at the west wall mortar. The bricks were old, held together more by habit than by structural integrity. After 20 minutes of patient work, a section came loose, revealing a hollow space behind. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a small journal bound in dark leather. My hands shook as I pulled it free and opened to the first page. Evelyn's handwriting filled the lines, elegant and precise. This is a record of what my husband has done. If you're reading this, I am likely dead. Do not let him tell you I was careless. Do not let him tell you it was an accident. I knew too much, and he could not afford to let me live. I turned the pages slowly, reading by flashlight, and the story emerged. Harold Bennett had started with bootlegging during Prohibition, using the smokehouse as a distribution hub. But when Prohibition ended, he'd found a more profitable business. He trafficked laborers, mostly migrants and transients, selling them to farms and factories that wanted workers they could exploit without legal consequence. The smokehouse had been a temporary holding facility, and those who tried to run, or those who saw too much, disappeared. Permanently. Evelyn's journal documented it all. Names, dates, amounts paid. She'd been preparing to go to the authorities when she wrote the final entries. Her last note was dated October 18th, 1936. Harold knows I've been watching. He's been too quiet lately, too kind. I recognize this mood. It's the one he wears before someone disappears. I've hidden copies of everything I've learned. If I don't survive this, someone will eventually find them. The truth has a way of coming up like bodies in water. The page ended there. The next page had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges behind. I closed the journal and looked at Clay. His face was grim in the harsh light of the headlamp. She knew he was going to kill her. And she still stayed, still documented everything, still tried to stop him. She was brave, Clay said quietly. We stood there in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of everything that had happened in this place. That's when we heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside, heavy boots coming closer. Multiple sets. Clay's hand went to his service weapon. Stay behind me. But before we could move, a shadow filled the doorway. A man in a dark hat and long coat stepped into the light, hands raised in a gesture of peace. It was the same man I'd seen watching from the tree line. Miss Bennett, he said, his voice smooth and cultured, completely at odds with his appearance. I apologize for startling you earlier. My name is Collins. I represent a historical preservation fund that's very interested in this property. I've been authorized to make you a generous offer. He pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. I didn't take it. How did you know I was here? I asked. Small town, people talk. And when someone starts digging up the past, certain interested parties take notice. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The past can be profitable, Miss Bennett, or it can be dangerous. Depends on how you handle it. It wasn't a threat. Not quite. But it was close enough. Clay stepped forward, positioning himself between Collins and me. I think you should leave now. Collins looked at Clay for a long moment, then nodded. Of course, Deputy. But Ms. Bennett, I do hope you'll consider our offer. Sometimes the best way to preserve history is to leave it undisturbed. He left the business card on the floor near the door and walked back into the darkness. We waited until we heard a car engine start and fade into the distance before either of us moved. He knew we were here, I said. He knew exactly when we'd find the journal. Clay picked up the business card. Collins Historical Preservation Fund, address in Nashville. I'll run a background check first thing in the morning, but I was already thinking ahead, planning. If Collins knew about the journal, then others did too. My grandmother's warning had been right. The past was coming up like bodies in water, and someone wanted very badly to push it back down. I didn't sleep that night. Back at the motel, I sat at the small desk with Evelyn's journal spread open under the lamp, reading every page, absorbing every detail. Her handwriting changed as the entries progressed, growing tighter, more urgent, as if she knew time was running out. The journal confirmed what we'd pieced together from the county records, but it went further. Evelyn had been meticulous. She documented the arrival of each truck, the number of people unloaded, the names when she could learn them. She'd sketched a crude map of the Smokehouse's interior, marking a trap door I hadn't found yet, located near the back wall beneath what she called the easy mouth. That phrase chilled me, the easy mouth. She'd written it without explanation, as if the meaning was too terrible to elaborate. One entry from September 1935 stood out. A girl arrived tonight. Couldn't be more than 16, wearing a yellow ribbon in her hair. She was crying, asking for her mother. Harold told her she'd be working at a farm, that it was good, honest work. But I've heard him make that promise before, and I've seen the places these people end up. Factories where the doors are locked from the outside. Farms where no one ever leaves. The girl with the ribbon looked at me when they led her past, and I saw my own daughter in her eyes. What kind of woman am I to know this is happening and do nothing? But what can I do? Harold would kill me if he knew I was writing this. He's killed before. I'm certain of it now. I trace my finger over the words, imagining Evelyn hunched over this journal by candlelight, writing in secret, building a case she might never live to present. My mother had been born in 1931, which meant she'd been 4 or 5 years old when Evelyn wrote this entry. Had she known? Had she heard things, seen things, that marked her childhood with shadows she could never quite explain? Was that why she'd disappeared too, leaving me with her sister when I was 15? Had she finally remembered something, finally understood what had happened to her mother? At dawn, I went back to the smokehouse. Clay had offered to come with me, but I needed to do this alone. The journal was my grandmother's voice reaching across time, and I felt like I owed her the privacy of a one-on-one conversation, even if she'd been dead for nearly 90 years, assuming she was dead. The thought stopped me cold as I pushed open the smokehouse door. What if Evelyn had faked her death? What if the scarf in the creek had been a deliberate misdirection, a way to escape Harold's reach? The journal ended abruptly, but it didn't contain a final entry. The last page had been torn out, the edges singed, as if someone had started to burn it and then changed their mind. I moved to the back wall, to the spot Evelyn had marked on her map. The floor here was different, slightly raised, covered with what looked like a removable grate. I knelt and worked my fingers under the edge. It lifted with surprising ease, as if it had been designed to be opened regularly. Beneath the grate was a drain, wide and deep, lined with old metal that had rusted but not corroded through. The easy mouth. This was where they'd sluiced away brine and blood and whatever else needed to disappear. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness and saw something glint. I reached down carefully and pulled out a small metal object. A locket, tarnished but intact. I pried it open and found 2 photographs inside, their images faded but still visible. One showed a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, Evelyn. The other showed a little girl, maybe 3 years old, laughing at the camera. My mother, Evelyn, had worn this locket, and at some point it had fallen or been dropped, or been deliberately hidden here. I clutched it tight, feeling the weight of connection, of proof that this was real, that these weren't just stories but lives lived and lost. That's when I heard them. The echoes, not humming this time but whispering. Multiple voices, children and adults, speaking all at once in a susurrus that raised every hair on my arms. I couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was urgent, insistent, as if they were trying to tell me something important. The whispers grew louder. converging on a single word repeated over and over. Ruth, Ruth, Ruth. I spun around, searching for the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the walls themselves, from the air. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was complete, oppressive. Broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing, I backed toward the door, locket still clutched in my hand, and nearly collided with someone standing in the entrance. I yelped and stumbled backward. Easy, easy. It's just me. Clay held up his hands, concern written across his face. I saw your truck outside. Figured I'd check in. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I heard them, I said. The voices. They said a name, Ruth. Clay stepped inside cautiously, looking around as if he might see what I'd heard. Ruth. That name showed up in one of the documents last night. I meant to mention it, but we were distracted by Collins. Ruth Calloway. She was listed as a character witness in a property dispute in 1937, vouching for someone named Mary Fletcher, who was trying to claim back wages from a farm. Owner. After Evelyn disappeared, right after. Clay pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos of the documents we'd scanned. Here, Ruth Calloway, resident of the county, testified that she'd helped Mary Fletcher find safe work after Fletcher escaped an exploitative labor situation. The case was dismissed, but Ruth's name appeared in a few other records after that. Always helping women, always testifying about labor abuses. We need to find out who she was. Already started looking. There's no birth record for a Ruth Calloway in this county or any surrounding counties. She just appeared in 1937, no history, no family, as if she materialized out of nowhere, like someone starting over, like someone hiding. My grandmother's middle name was Ruth, I said quietly. Clay met my eyes, understanding dawning. You think Evelyn faked her death and became Ruth Calloway? I think it's possible. And I think someone else knows it too. I showed him the locket and explained about the torn page in the journal. The singed edges, suggesting Evelyn had considered destroying evidence, but hadn't, as if she'd wanted to leave a trail for someone brave. Enough or desperate enough to follow. We need to search for Ruth Calloway, Clay said. Birth records, death records, property holdings, anything that might tell us if she's still alive or where she went. And we need to find that trapdoor Evelyn marked on her map. We spent the next hour searching the smokehouse floor, tapping on boards, looking for seams or hinges. Clay found it beneath a scatter of old straw near the corner. The trapdoor was small, maybe 3 feet square, designed to be concealed. It opened onto a ladder, descending into darkness. I'm going down, I said before Clay could argue. Not alone, you're not. We descended together, flashlights cutting through the blackness. The space below was cramped and cold, a crawl space maybe 4 feet high, supported by beams that looked original to the building. Salt crystals crusted the wood, and the air smelled of earth and old meat, and something chemical I couldn't identify. Along one beam, someone had written in chalk, the mark still faintly visible. Initials and dates: EM 1933S, UDR 1934, TB 1935, dozens of them. A ghostly roster of people who'd passed through this space, this prison, this way station to whatever fate Harold Bennett had arranged for them. Look at this. Clay pointed to a small crate shoved against the far wall. Inside were glass flasks, empty now, but stained with residue, and a stack of papers held together with string. The papers were invoices, coded but clear enough once you understood the system. Names, ages, prices, destinations. Sarah Mitchell, the missing woman from the 1933 report, was listed with a price of $65 and a destination coded as MF. Mary Fletcher, the woman Ruth Calloway had helped. I photographed everything, working quickly, aware that we were running out of time. Collins knew about this place. Others might know too. The descendants of the people who'd profited from Harold's operation, who'd paid for labor they could exploit without consequence, who'd built fortunes on the backs of people who'd had no choice, no voice, no protection. As I photographed the last page, I heard it. A vehicle pulling up outside, doors slamming, voices. Clay grabbed my arm. We need to leave. Now. We climbed back up the ladder as quietly as we could. Through the gaps in the smokehouse walls, I could see 3 figures approaching. One of them was Collins. The others were larger, moving with the purposeful gait of men used to enforcing decisions through physical presence. "There's a vent on the back wall," Clay whispered, low to the ground, hidden by blackberry canes. I noticed it when I was checking the structure's perimeter. "It's our only exit." We crawled to the vent, and Clay used his multi-tool to pry off the rusted grate. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, but it led outside. I went first, wriggling through the gap, blackberry thorns catching on my clothes and scraping my skin. Clay followed, replacing the grate as best he could behind us. We stayed low, moving through the undergrowth until we reached Clay's cruiser parked behind the main house. Only then did I look back and see Collins standing in the smokehouse doorway, phone to his ear, gesturing to his companions. He looked angry, and he looked determined. We drove to Clay's office, a small building attached to the county courthouse. Inside, I felt marginally safer, surrounded by the infrastructure of law enforcement. Even if I knew that law enforcement had been complicit in Harold's crimes decades ago. Clay made coffee while I uploaded all the photos to a cloud account, then sent copies to 3 different email addresses I'd set up, specifically for archiving sensitive research. If something happened to us, if Collins and whoever he represented managed to bury this again, at least the evidence would exist somewhere. I ran a background check on Collins, Clay said, setting a mug in front of me. The Preservation Fund is real, legally incorporated, but it's funded by anonymous donors. The board members are all lawyers and accountants, the kind of people who specialize in making things go away, quietly. Who are the donors? That's the question. Shell companies, trusts, foundations. It would take months to untangle, and we'd need subpoena power to get the real names. But I can tell you this. The fund has purchased and sealed off at least 7 properties in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Arkansas over the last 20 years. All of them date back to the Prohibition era. All of them were involved in agricultural labor operations. They're covering up a network, I said. This wasn't just my grandfather. It was an entire system, Clay nodded grimly. And the descendants of the people who ran that system, who profited from it, they've banded together to make sure it stays hidden. Because if the truth came out, there would be liability, lawsuits, criminal investigations into family fortunes that were built on human trafficking. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We can make this easy, Ms. Bennett. Name your price." I showed it to Clay. He frowned. "They're watching you. Probably traced your phone or hacked your email. We need to be careful." But I was done being careful. I was done treating this like an academic exercise where the goal was documentation without disruption. My grandmother had died or disappeared trying to stop this. My mother had vanished trying to understand it. I wasn't going to let fear silence me too. I typed back, "I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in the truth." The response came within seconds. "Truth is expensive. Miss Bennett, some costs are too high to pay." "He's threatening me," I said, "or warning you." Clay checked his service weapon, a gesture that I found both comforting and terrifying. "Stay here. I'm going to make some calls. Reach out to state investigators I trust. We need protection, and we need authority that extends beyond this county." While Clay made his calls, I returned to Evelyn's journal, reading the later entries I'd skipped in my first pass. One in particular caught my attention. "I met a woman in town today, someone passing through, looking for work. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she reminded me of myself 10 years ago, before I understood what I'd married into. We talked for an hour in the church basement, and I saw my own fear reflected in her eyes. She'd escaped from a factory in Kentucky, a place where women were locked in at night and paid in scrip that could only be spent at the company store. She'd walked for 3 days to get here. I gave her food and money, and I told her about the cabin near Shoal Creek, the one my family used to own before they died. It's been empty for years, but it's safe. I told her if she needed to disappear, that's where she should go. She thanked me and left, but I kept thinking, what if I'm the one who needs to disappear? What if I'm the one who needs a place where Harold can't find me? Shoal Creek, that was only 15 miles from here. And if Evelyn had given Ruth Calloway directions to a safe house, maybe she'd used it herself. Maybe she'd become Ruth Calloway, taking the name of someone she'd helped, someone who might have moved on or died, someone whose identity could provide cover. Clay returned, his expression tight. "I've got a state investigator coming tomorrow morning. She's good, thorough, and she's built cases against old families before. But that means we need to keep you safe tonight. Collins and his people, they're escalating. My contact at the county dispatcher said there have been 3 calls about suspicious vehicles near the Bennett property in the last hour. They're coordinating something." "Let them come," I said, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice.
"I'm not hiding."
"Not anymore. Nora. My grandmother spent years documenting these crimes, risking her life to build a case no one would listen to. I'm not going to throw that away because some well-dressed enforcer wants to buy my silence." Clay studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, but we do this smart. We go back to the Smokehouse, we document everything we haven't documented yet, and we do it with backup. I'm calling in favors. By tonight, we'll have enough eyes on that property that Collins won't dare try anything, but Collins was smarter than we gave him credit for. He didn't try anything at the property. He came directly to us. The office door opened, and Collins walked in as if he owned the place, followed by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as an attorney representing the Preservation Fund. They carried briefcases and wore expressions of polite concern that couldn't quite hide the steel underneath. "Ms. Bennett, Deputy Mercer," Collins said, taking a seat without being invited. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. We're not your enemies. We're historians like you, Ms. Bennett. We want to preserve the past, not destroy it. By burying it," I said, "by protecting it. The Bennett property contains sensitive historical materials that, if mishandled, could cause significant harm. Not just to your family's reputation, but to other families, other communities. The past is complicated. Sometimes mercy is more important than truth. Mercy for whom? Not for the people my grandfather trafficked. Not for the families who never found out what happened to their missing daughters and sons. Not for my grandmother who died trying to expose this." Collins' expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, reassessment. "We have reason to believe your grandmother didn't die, Miss Bennett, that she faked her death and lived under an assumed name for many years. If that's true, then she chose to let the past remain buried. Perhaps you should respect that choice." The words hit me like cold water. They knew about Ruth Calloway. They knew Evelyn might still be alive, or might have been until recently, which meant they'd been tracking her, watching her, ensuring she didn't break her silence. If she chose silence, I said carefully, it was because she was afraid. Afraid of you, or people like you. Or perhaps, the attorney interjected smoothly, she chose silence because she understood that some truths cause more harm than healing. "We're prepared to offer you a substantial sum for the property and all materials you've recovered. You could continue your academic work elsewhere, funded generously, with no financial concerns. All we ask is your discretion. You're asking me to sell my family's crimes for a check. We're asking you to be pragmatic. The people who suffered in the 1930s are long dead. Justice for them is impossible. But causing pain to their descendants, to communities that have moved on, that's very possible. Is that really what you want your legacy to be?" Clay stood abruptly. "I think you should leave now." Collins and the attorney exchanged glances. Then Collins stood, leaving a business card and a sealed envelope on the desk. "The offer stands until midnight tomorrow. After that, things become more complicated. For everyone involved." They left, and I picked up the envelope. Inside was a check for $500,000, made out to me, with a memo line that read, "Property acquisition and historical preservation." "They're serious," Clay said. "So am I." I tore the check in half. "We're going to Shoal Creek tonight." Clay tried to convince me to wait, to bring the state investigator with us, to do this officially. But I couldn't wait. If Collins knew about Ruth Calloway, if he knew Evelyn might have survived, then he might already be moving to eliminate any evidence, any witnesses, any proof that the woman who documented Harold Bennett's crimes had lived to tell about it. We took Clay's personal truck instead of the cruiser, keeping off main roads, following the creek line until we found the turnoff Evelyn had mentioned in her journal. The cabin was set back from the road, almost hidden by overgrown pine and kudzu. It looked abandoned, windows dark, porch sagging, but there was something deliberate about it, as if the decay was camouflage rather than neglect. We approached quietly. Clay checked the perimeter while I examined the front door. It was locked, but the lock was new, modern, completely at odds with the cabin's apparent abandonment. Someone had been here recently. Someone was maintaining this place while making it look forgotten. "Back door's the same," Clay whispered when he returned. "New lock, reinforced frame. This isn't an abandoned cabin. It's a safe house. We found a window that opened with some effort, and I climbed through into what appeared to be a kitchen. The interior was clean, organized, nothing like the exterior suggested. Canned goods lined the shelves, all recent dates. A kettle sat on the propane stove, and when I touched it, warmth still radiated from the metal. Someone had been here within the last hour. Clay climbed through behind me, and we moved deeper into the cabin. The main room held simple furniture, handmade quilts, and shelves lined with books. Medical texts, midwifery guides, journals on women's health and safety. On a small desk near the window sat a shortwave radio and a logbook filled with codes and frequencies. "This is a station in an underground railroad," I said quietly, running my finger along the radio's dials. "For women escaping abuse, exploitation, trafficking. Someone's been running this for decades." In the bedroom we found more evidence. A shoebox filled with letters, all addressed to E, and signed with initials only. I opened one at random and read, "Dear E, I made it to Oregon safely. I'm working at a cannery under my new name. No one here knows where I came from or what happened before. Thank you for giving me a second chance at life. I'll never forget what you did for us. M.F. Mary Fletcher, the woman Ruth Calloway had testified for. She'd escaped, built a new life, survived, and she'd written to thank the woman who'd helped her. There were dozens of letters like this spanning decades. From the 1940s to the early 2000s, women who'd found their way to this cabin, to this woman who'd helped them disappear, who'd given them new identities and new chances. Women who'd been trafficked, abused, exploited, and who'd found salvation through an underground network that operated in the shadows, doing the work that law enforcement wouldn't or couldn't do, and all the letters were addressed to E. Evelyn. She didn't die, I whispered. She faked her death, became Ruth Calloway, and spent the rest of her life undoing what Harold had done. She saved them, all of them. Clay picked up a photograph from the dresser. It showed an elderly woman, thin and white-haired, standing on this very porch. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were unmistakable. Evelyn's eyes, my grandmother's eyes. This was taken recently, Clay said, checking the back. 2 years ago. She was alive 2 years ago. The front door opened. We spun around, and there she stood. The woman from the photograph, older now, more frail, leaning on a broom handle like a walking stick. But alive, unmistakably, impossibly alive. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw recognition dawn in her eyes. "You sound like her," she said softly, her voice rough with age but steady with purpose. "You sound like my daughter. Like Nora's mother." "I'm Nora," I said, barely able to form the words. "Your granddaughter, Evelyn Bennett, who'd been dead for 87 years, who'd been Ruth Calloway for longer than she'd been herself, smiled. It was a smile that contained grief and joy in equal measure, the smile of someone who'd sacrificed everything and had finally been found. I know who you are, child. I've been waiting for you." Evelyn moved slowly to the kitchen table and lowered herself into a chair, gesturing for us to sit. Clay remained standing, one hand near his weapon, still wary. But I sat, unable to take my eyes off this woman who shouldn't exist, who'd haunted my family like a ghost while living, breathing, surviving in the shadows. "I saw the news about Harold's death," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I knew someone would inherit the property. I prayed it wouldn't be you, that you'd be spared this. But I also knew that if it was you, you'd be the one to look. You're a historian. It's in your blood. Why didn't you come forward? I asked. All these years you could have been killed? Oh yes, child. That's exactly what would have happened. Evelyn poured water from a pitcher into 3 glasses, her hands steady despite her age. Harold had friends, powerful friends, men who'd built their fortunes on the labor he provided, who'd made investments in the network he ran. When I threatened to expose him, he made it very clear what would happen. Not just to me, but to your mother, to my baby. So you faked your death. I had help. A doctor who understood what was happening, who falsified a death certificate. A sheriff from the next county who'd been trying to investigate Harold but couldn't make anything stick. We staged the drowning, complete with my scarf in the creek, and a witness who swore they'd seen me fall. And then I disappeared and became Ruth Calloway. I borrowed the name from a woman I'd helped, a woman who'd moved on and wouldn't need her identity anymore. I dyed my hair, changed the way I dressed, and I became someone else. Someone who could work in the shadows, helping the people Harold and his associates had exploited. If I couldn't stop them through law, I'd undo their work one person at a time. Clay finally sat, his expression troubled. You ran an underground railroad for 70 years. Women mostly, sometimes men. People who'd been sold into labor situations they couldn't escape, who'd been threatened, abused, worked until they broke. I gave them new names, new documents, new lives. I had helpers, people who believed in the work. We moved hundreds of people to safety, and no one ever caught on? Oh, they suspected. Colin's predecessors, they came sniffing around a few times over the years. But I was careful. I kept moving, kept changing, kept the network decentralized. And I had protection, information I'd collected over decades. Names, dates, evidence of ongoing crimes. If they moved against me, I made sure they understood that everything I knew would become public. I thought of the journal, the documents hidden in the smokehouse, the evidence Evelyn had spent years compiling. Mutually assured destruction. Exactly, Evelyn sipped her water. But Harold's death changed things. The property went to you, which meant the evidence would eventually be found. Collins and his people, they've been trying to buy up every property connected to the old network, trying to sanitize the history, bury the truth. They can't have you exposing what happened. It threatens too many families, too much wealth. Good, I said. Let it threaten them. Let them face what their families did. Evelyn studied me, and I saw something like pride in her eyes. You have your mother's fire. She had it too, you know. That's why she left. She started remembering things from her childhood, things she'd buried. She began asking questions I couldn't safely answer. So she went looking on her own. My heart clenched. What happened to her? I don't know. She disappeared 20 years ago, and I never heard from her again. I've searched, used every contact I had, but it's like she vanished into thin air. Either she found something that got her killed, or she found something that made her disappear the way I did. I pray it's the latter. The pain in her voice was raw, immediate, despite the decades that had passed. She'd survived, saved hundreds of others, but she'd lost her daughter, and she'd never stopped looking. Clay's phone buzzed. He checked it and his face went pale. We need to leave, now. Collins just pulled up to the Bennett property with a construction crew. They're claiming emergency demolition rights, saying the structure is hazardous. They're going to bring down the smokehouse. No, I said. All the evidence is already documented, Clay interrupted. You photographed everything. It's in the cloud. They can't erase what you've already preserved, but I understood what this meant. They were destroying the physical site, the place where crimes had occurred, the building that held the echo of voices and suffering. They were erasing the sacred space of testimony. Let them, Evelyn said quietly. The building doesn't matter. The truth matters. And you have that now. You have my journal. You have the documents. You have living testimony. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was paper-thin, her bones bird-fragile, but her grip was strong. You have me. They'll come after you. Let them try. I'm 110 years old, child. I've outlived Harold. outlived most of his associates, outlived their children. I'm ready to speak. I'm ready to be found. But more than that, I'm ready to watch you finish what I started." She stood and walked to a closet, pulling out a cardboard box. Inside were more documents, more letters, more evidence. Years of work, carefully preserved, waiting for this moment. "This is everything," she said. "Names of the donors who funded the network, locations of other properties, testimonies from the women I helped, women who are still alive and willing to speak now that Harold is dead. And most importantly this," she handed me a photograph. It showed a group of men in suits, posed in front of the smokehouse, smiling. The image was dated 1934. I recognized Harold immediately, his charismatic smile captured for posterity. But the other men were unfamiliar. "Turn it over," Evelyn said. On the back, in Evelyn's careful script, were names. Not just the men in the photo, but their descendants. Family trees showing how wealth and influence had passed down through generations. How the profits from Harold's operation had funded businesses, political careers, charitable foundations. Colin's real name was there. So were names I recognized from state politics, from corporate boards, from the Preservation Fund's anonymous donor list that Clay had mentioned. "This is a map," I said. "It's a reckoning," Evelyn replied. "And it's time." We didn't have much time. Clay made calls, while Evelyn and I packed the documents, creating multiple copies, distributing them to different locations. Cloud storage, physical copies sent to journalists Clay trusted, encrypted files uploaded to secure servers. If Collins wanted to bury this, he'd have to dig up half the internet and every newspaper in the state. "The state investigator is already en route," Clay said, hanging up from his fourth call. "ETA 2 hours. But Collins has at least 6 men at the property now. They've started bringing in equipment." "Then we go now," I said. "Before they can destroy everything," Evelyn shook her head. "They want you to come. They're hoping you'll try to stop them, give them a reason to claim you were trespassing, interfering with legitimate work." "It's a trap." "Then we spring it," I said. "But on our terms." Clay looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I'd spent my entire adult life studying history from a safe distance, analyzing the past without ever risking anything. My grandmother had risked everything. My mother had disappeared trying to understand the truth. I wasn't going to hide while they erased what was left. "What do you have in mind?" Clay asked. "We live stream it. Everything. We go to the Smokehouse, we confront Collins, and we broadcast the whole thing. If something happens to us, thousands of people will have watched it happen." Evelyn smiled. And in that smile I saw the young woman who'd stood up to Harold Bennett, who documented his crimes knowing he'd kill her if he found out. "You really are my granddaughter." We set up the stream using my phone and Clay's as backups, linking them to my academic social media accounts and several news outlets Clay had contacted. Within minutes of going live, we had viewers. Within 10 minutes, we had hundreds. By the time we pulled up to the Bennett property, we had thousands. The smokehouse was lit by portable floodlights, harsh and unforgiving. Collins stood near the entrance, supervising 2 men who were attaching chains to the building's support beams. A small excavator idled nearby, ready to pull the structure down. When he saw us approaching, Collins' expression went from confident to wary to angry in rapid succession. "Miss Bennett, you're trespassing on a condemned property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is my property," I said, holding up my phone so the camera captured both of us. "And you're destroying it without authorization." For everyone watching, this man represents a preservation fund that's been systematically buying up properties connected to human trafficking operations from the 1930s. He's not preserving history. He's erasing it. Colin's face went pale. "Turn that off, now." "No." I moved closer, keeping the camera steady. "You wanted to buy my silence. You threatened me when I refused. Now the whole world is watching. So tell us, Mr. Collins, or whatever your real name is, why are you so desperate to destroy this building? This structure is hazardous. It's a public safety. It's evidence," I interrupted. "Evidence of crimes your family profited from. Your great-grandfather was one of the men who bought labor from Harold Bennett. I have the receipts. I have the documents. "And I have something else," I gestured, and Evelyn stepped into the light. She moved slowly, leaning on Clay for support, but her presence was electric. Collins stared at her as if seeing a ghost, which in a way he was. "My name is Evelyn Bennett," she said, her voice carrying in the cold night air, clear enough for the phone's microphone to capture. "I was declared dead in 1936, but I survived. I survived because I had to. Because my husband was trafficking human beings, and I was the only one who knew. I documented everything, and I've spent the last 87 years making sure that what he did, what all of them did, would not be forgotten." Collins reached for his phone, but Clay stepped between them. "I wouldn't do that. You're already being recorded by about 5,000 people. Anything you do now becomes part of the public record. You have no authority here, Deputy. This is outside your jurisdiction." "Actually," a new voice called from the darkness, "he has all the authority he needs." A woman in a state investigator's jacket emerged from the shadows, flanked by two uniformed officers. "Special Agent Sarah Chen, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. We've been monitoring this situation for the last hour. Mr. Collins, I'm going to need you and your associates to step away from the structure and submit to questioning." "On what grounds?" "Destruction of evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation, witness intimidation, conspiracy to obstruct justice." "Should I continue?" Collins' face went from pale to red. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. The families I represent, they have lawyers, resources, and I have evidence of multi-generational criminal conspiracy," Agent Chen interrupted, "along with testimony from a woman who was there, who saw it all, who documented everything. So here's what's going to happen. You and your crew are going to stand down. This property is now a crime scene, and it will be processed accordingly. Any attempt to interfere will result in immediate arrest." For a moment, I thought Collins might argue. But then he looked at my phone, still streaming, still recording, and I saw the calculation in his eyes. Whatever authority he'd wielded in the shadows, it evaporated in the light. He nodded to his crew, and they shut down the equipment. "This isn't over," he said quietly, looking directly at me. "Yes, it is," I replied. "It's been over since the moment my grandmother carved the first name into that wall. You just didn't know it yet." As Collins and his men were led away for questioning, Agent Chen approached us. "Miss Bennett, I need to secure this site, but first I'd like to hear Mrs. Bennett's full testimony. All of it. And I'd like it on record. We spent the rest of the night in the Smokehouse telling the story. Evelyn spoke for hours, her memory sharp, her details precise. She named names, provided dates, described the operation with the clarity of someone who'd been waiting decades to finally speak. Clay and I added what we'd found, the documents, the photographs, the evidence we'd collected. The live stream ended, but the documentation continued. Agent Chen's team photographed everything, catalogued every carving, every hidden space, every artifact. They found the trapdoor, descended into the crawl space, and emerged with evidence that would take months to fully process. As dawn began to thin the darkness, I stood outside the smokehouse and watched the sun rise over the property. The building looked different now, no longer menacing but somehow peaceful, as if it could finally rest. The voices, the echoes were silent. Whatever they'd needed to communicate, whatever testimony they'd tried to give, had been heard. Evelyn joined me, moving stiffly but steadily. "Your mother would be proud of you. Do you think she's alive?" I asked. "Do you think she's out there somewhere the way you were?" "I hope so. God, I hope so. But even if she's not, even if we never find her, she'd be glad you finished this. She'd be glad the truth came out. What happens now? To you, I mean." After all this, Evelyn was quiet for a moment, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I'm tired, child, so tired. I've been running and hiding for most of my life. But I think, maybe, I can finally stop. I can finally just be Evelyn Bennett again, even if it's only for a little while." 6 weeks later, I stood in what used to be the Smokehouse's clearing. The building was gone, carefully dismantled under state supervision, every board catalogued, every artifact preserved. In its place, a memorial garden was taking shape. Volunteers from the county had planted flowers, installed benches, and erected a stone marker that read, "In memory of those who suffered here and in honor of those who survived." The story had exploded across national media. Evelyn's testimony had opened floodgates, prompting investigations into dozens of properties across multiple states. Other families had come forward with their own stories, their own evidence of exploitation and trafficking that had been dismissed or ignored for generations. The Preservation Fund had been dissolved, its donors exposed, their family fortunes suddenly subject to lawsuits and criminal investigations. Collins was awaiting trial on multiple charges. So were 11 other men, descendants of Harold Bennett's associates, men who'd known about the crimes and had worked to cover them up. The legal process would take years, but the truth was out. That was what mattered. Clay walked up beside me, carrying a box of violet plants. Mrs. Henderson from the library sent these. She said Evelyn mentioned violets in one of her journal entries, something about hope growing in dark places. "Help me plant them," I said. We worked in companionable silence, digging small holes, nestling the delicate plants into the earth. Around us, other volunteers worked on different parts of the garden. A group of high school students was installing a memorial wall where the names from the Smokehouse carvings would be etched in stone. An elderly woman I didn't recognize was planting roses near the entrance path. "Excuse me," the woman called. "Are you Nora Bennett?" I stood, brushing dirt from my knees. "Yes, can I help you?" She smiled, and I saw tears in her eyes. My grandmother was one of the women Evelyn helped. Her name was Mary Fletcher. She escaped from a factory in Kentucky and made it to the cabin at Shoal Creek. Evelyn gave her a new identity, helped her start over. She lived to be 92 years old, happy and free, because of what your grandmother did. The woman pulled a photograph from her purse and handed it to me. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a shy smile, standing in front of a small house holding a baby. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Oregon 1938, finally home. She wanted me to find you if the truth ever came out," the woman continued. She wanted me to say thank you. Not just from her, but from all of us who wouldn't exist if Evelyn hadn't saved our grandmothers. I couldn't speak. I just nodded and hugged this stranger who was connected to me through threads of courage and survival that stretched across generations. More people came as the morning progressed. Children and grandchildren of women Evelyn had helped. Researchers interested in documenting the Underground Railroad she'd operated. Journalists writing books about the case. Lawyers representing families who wanted to file civil suits against the descendants who'd profited from exploitation. And through it all, I thought about legacy. Not the legacy of Harold Bennett, which was being dismantled brick by brick, but the legacy of Evelyn, which grew stronger with every person who came forward, every story that was finally told. Every life that had been saved and allowed to flourish. A county resolution had been passed, funding a historical center dedicated to labor exploitation during Prohibition. I'd been asked to curate the exhibit using the journals and documents Evelyn had preserved. It would open in 6 months, and Evelyn had agreed to speak at the dedication ceremony. She tired easily now, the strain of testimony and public attention taking its toll on her 110-year-old body. But she was content in a way I'd never seen in the photographs of her as a young woman. She was finally fully visible, finally at rest. Clay and I had grown closer through the weeks of depositions and interviews. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet understanding that we'd been through something together, that we'd stood for something that mattered. He'd testified against his own great-grandfather's involvement, making it clear that acknowledging historical wrongs was more important than protecting family reputation. It had cost him relationships with some relatives, but it had also earned him respect throughout the state. "What will you do now?" he asked as we finished planting the last of the violets. "Stay," I said, surprising myself. "I thought I'd go back to Nashville, back to my teaching position. But there's work here, real work. documenting what happened, making sure it's remembered correctly, helping other communities find their own buried truths. I want to be part of that. The county could use a good historian, Clay said, and the warmth in his eyes suggested he meant more than just professionally. Before I could respond, my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Hello? Nora? The voice was hesitant, unfamiliar, but something in its cadence made my heart stop. Yes, who is this? My name is Ruth Morgan. I saw the news coverage. I saw what you did, what you found. And I think I might be your mother. The world tilted. What? I disappeared 20 years ago. I had to. I remembered things from my childhood, terrible things, and when I started asking questions, someone warned me to stop. Told me that if I kept digging, I'd end up like my mother. So I ran, changed my name, built a new life. But I never stopped wondering if she was really dead, if maybe she'd escaped the way I did. Where are you? I could barely form the words. Colorado. I have a small bookstore in Denver. I've been watching the case unfold, watching you testify, and I kept thinking you looked familiar. Then I saw the picture they showed of Evelyn when she was young, and I knew she was my mother, and I knew you were my daughter. Tears streamed down my face. Come home, please, come meet your mother. Come meet me. Come home. There was a long pause, and I could hear her crying too. Okay, yes, I'll come home. 3 months later, the historical center opened in a converted warehouse in town. The exhibit I'd curated filled 2 floors, combining Evelyn's journals with oral histories from survivors and their families, with photographs and documents that told the story of not just Harold Bennett's operation, but the larger network of exploitation that had functioned across the South during Prohibition and beyond. The centerpiece was the west wall from the Smokehouse, carefully preserved, with its carvings still visible. Visitors could read the names, the dates, the tally marks, and understand that each mark represented a human life, a person who'd been trafficked, exploited, or had disappeared. But the exhibit didn't end with darkness. The final room was dedicated to resistance, to the women who'd fought back, to Evelyn's Underground Railroad, to the survivors who'd built new lives. Letters from the women Evelyn had helped lined the walls. Photographs showed their families, their children and grandchildren who existed because one woman had refused to stay silent. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people, local officials, state representatives, survivors and their families, researchers and activists. But the moment that mattered most was when Evelyn took the podium, flanked by me on one side and my mother on the other. My mother had arrived 2 weeks earlier, tentative and scared, but determined to reconnect with the family she'd run from. The reunion with Evelyn had been tender and painful, filled with tears and recriminations and forgiveness. They'd spent hours talking, sharing stories, filling in the gaps of decades spent apart. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't be. Too much had been lost. Too much time had passed. But it was real, and it was honest, and it was theirs. Now Evelyn stood before the crowd, her voice carrying through the speakers, strong despite her age. My name is Evelyn Ruth Bennett, and I am 110 years old. I have lived 3 lives. The first as the wife of a criminal, complicit through my silence. The second as Ruth Calloway, working in secret to undo the harm I'd failed to prevent. And now, finally, as myself again, speaking truth in the light. She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. I spent 87 years hiding because I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I spoke, afraid of the power men like my husband wielded, afraid that my testimony wouldn't matter. But my granddaughter taught me something important. The truth always matters, even when it comes late, even when it costs everything, even when it's spoken by an old woman who should have died decades ago. Laughter rippled through the crowd, gentle and warm. This center represents more than just history. It represents a promise that we will no longer allow the powerful to bury their crimes, that we will listen to the voices that have been silenced, that we will remember the names of those who suffered and celebrate the names of those who survived. And most importantly, that we will do better for all our children, for all our futures. The crowd erupted in applause. I found myself crying again, but this time they were tears of pride and relief. We'd done it. We'd brought the truth to light. We'd honored the dead and validated the living. After the ceremony, as people mingled and explored the exhibit, a young woman approached me. She carried a notebook and wore an expression of fierce determination that reminded me of myself 6 months ago. "Miss Bennett? My name is Amanda Chen. I'm a graduate student in history. I just found some strange carvings in my family's old cannery in the next county. They look like the ones you described from your grandfather's smokehouse. Names and dates from the 1930s. I was wondering if you could help me figure out what they mean." I looked at Clay, who'd been standing nearby. He smiled and nodded. Then I looked at my mother, who'd been listening to the conversation. She smiled too, encouragement in her eyes. "Yes," I told Amanda. "I can help. We'll start tomorrow. Bring everything you've found, and we'll begin the work of uncovering the truth. That's what historians do. That's what we're called to do." As the afternoon light faded into evening, I stood in the memorial garden with Evelyn and my mother, watching children plant more violets under the supervision of volunteers. The garden had grown beyond what I'd imagined, filling the entire clearing where the smokehouse once stood. Benches invited contemplation. Stone paths wound between flower beds, and at the center, a simple marker bore the words Evelyn had chosen. "Everyone belongs. Everyone matters. Everyone is remembered." Evelyn reached over and took my hand in her papery, age-spotted grip. On my other side, my mother did the same. 3 generations of Bennett women, connected finally not by secrets and silence, but by truth and courage. "I used to think my legacy would be that smokehouse," Evelyn said quietly. "That building where so much suffering happened. I thought that's all I'd leave behind, that shame and those sins. But that's not your legacy," I said. "Your legacy is this: all the lives you saved, all the women who found freedom because of you, all the truth that finally came to light because you were brave enough to document it. And you," Evelyn said, squeezing my hand. "You're my legacy too, both of you. Women who refuse to be silent. Women who finish what others started. Women who make the crooked places straight." My mother laughed softly. "That's from Isaiah. You always loved that verse, still do. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain." That's what we've done, isn't it? We've leveled the ground, made it possible for others to walk on solid footing without stumbling over buried lies. A breeze moved through the garden, carrying the scent of violets and fresh earth. Somewhere in the trees, a child laughed. The sound was bright and clean, untroubled by the darkness that had once saturated this place. I thought about the tin lid I'd found on my first day in the smokehouse. The one Evelyn had punched with her initials. E.B. I'd kept it, carried it with me through everything that followed. But Evelyn had given it a new meaning. "You've made it mean everyone belongs," she'd said when she'd seen it on my desk. "Everyone belongs. Everyone matters. Everyone is remembered." That was the legacy we'd built together, the 3 of us and all the others who'd contributed their stories, their courage, their truth. Not a legacy of smoke and ash, but of light and growing things. Not a legacy of secrets buried in the dark, but of names spoken in the open air. The sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. Tomorrow, I would start work with Amanda Chen, beginning the process of uncovering another buried truth. There would be more smokehouses, more hidden rooms, more carved names waiting to be read. The work would continue, expanding outward in ripples that would reach places I couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, I simply stood with my grandmother and my mother in a garden built on the ruins of a crime, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace, purpose, and the bone-deep certainty that some legacies, the ones worth leaving, are lighter than smoke and stronger than stone. They're built on truth. And truth, once spoken, can never be completely silenced again. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.